a radio station.
Hi there. Welcome to this month's online dance talk. So Oliver can't be here with us this time, so I will be introducing our guest speaker, Yoav Bergner, a good friend. So this will be a really exciting talk. Yoav is a research scientist in computational psychometrics at ETS. And he's been there for a few years now. Before that, he was at MIT, and he's been doing work actively in the MOOC space as well as in other spaces. And so particularly today, he is going to be talking about some work on collaborative problem-solving assessment. Ooh, I hope you can't see my screen. Okay, yes. And as usual, you are welcome to submit questions. We'll be monitoring those. So Yoav will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion time. So please feel free to type in your questions, and then we will cover those at the end. And in particular, also, I would like to encourage you to check out our resources page. We continue to update that with there have been some new resources that have been submitted by community members. So we're starting to beef up our offerings, not just from Carnegie Mellon researchers, but also from the broader dance community. So without any further delay, I'd just like to pass the mic over to Yoav.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. I hope everybody can hear me. I don't get feedback if you can, so except that Carolyn seems to be nodding. So thank you for this opportunity to talk, and I will try to share my screen according to the protocols of sharing my whole desktop so that I can put my slides into slide mode. It says I'm screen sharing now. So in theory, if I do this, you can now see it. But I don't know that I would know if you couldn't. So
great.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this is the topic, and this is an extension, a little bit of a topic that I covered at the Learning with MOOCs workshop in New York, if some of you heard that. So there will be some repeated coverage there. So by way of motivation, there's actually sort of two angles to motivating this work, and one of which should seem obvious, and the other one which is a little bit more related to the assessment community. But the first motivation is just that the affordance of pairwise or small group discussion in regular classrooms is well established and highly valued. And of course, in moving to online learning management systems, that affordance needs to be replaced by some form of computer-mediated discussion. So having used the edX learning management system from pretty much the beginning, or at least looking at data when I was a postdoc at MIT from the first MIT XMOOC, which then got folded into edX, it was always strange to me that edX didn't have small group discussions built into it. So basically, it turned out that's pretty common, that learning management systems have asynchronous discussion forums, but not real-time affordances. So we're using Google Hangouts to have this live experience, and of course Skype and Google Hangouts exist, but sending students off to use those tools means that they're not sort of having an integrated experience with the learning management system. It means that you're not able to necessarily log what's going on in those conversations. Sometimes it's possible, but it's definitely a lot of extra work if it's possible at all. So certainly some people have already done work on bringing real-time discussions into learning environments and making it possible to use those through either LTI standards or some other kind of interoperability standard. Two examples are, of course, a Bazaar system from Carolyn and collaborators at Carnegie Mellon, and MOOC Chat from some Berkeley folks. And one thing about those two systems is they run remotely. You can use them in edX, but they through LTI, but they run remotely, and they were designed with a kind of task creation environment in mind, or at least a kind of scripting environment in mind. So they weren't like totally minimalistic, which is actually what we wanted. Just the ability to just kind of have a chat tool that's part of a learning management system, but the only thing that it necessarily has to have is the ability for groups to be small. And so that's sort of one motivation, is just that this didn't exist the way we wanted it to exist. And the other motivation, which is sort of a big part of where I was coming from and am coming from, is that this is small group discussions is interesting to assessment folks from a assessment of collaboration and collaborative problem solving angle. So there's a lot of research, and I'm not going to summarize it, but there's sort of some of it is described in this paper from my colleagues Alina van Davier and Peter Halpin about the history of sort of small group research on evaluating groups and evaluating individuals within groups. And so moving that into computer-based systems, you just want to have that affordance. I'll say a tiny bit about why ETS would support doing work in an open source platform, because I think it's just sort of interesting from an industry perspective. There are groups, the group that I belong to, as well as the Center for Academic Workforce Readiness at ETS, that are interested in understanding collaboration. And there are proprietary developments at ETS with regard to future products. So ETS does sometimes develop proprietary technologies, but at the same time, ETS is a non-for-profit organization with an educational service mission. So making an open source contribution to Open edX is consistent with that mission, and also promotes being able to share this tool and collaborate with external partners. The other main advantage, when I sort of tried to pitch this to the people who had to support this at ETS, was that Open edX already has a lot of really cool assessment tools, and it's pretty easy to stand up an instance of Open edX and then send your research subjects to take this experimental test, and you don't need to engage an external software developer to spend a whole lot of time just to prototype something. So basically, that's the starting point. The starting point is we wanted to develop this technology, make it freely available, and then do something with it from our application interest, which was a collaborative assessment design. And here's the basic design. It's really, really simple. Two participants are involved in solving math problems. They take two tests. They could take them in either one first. That's sort of an experimental thing. But basically, one test is just taken individually. So you get a measurement of their math ability, broadly defined. And the other one is taken collaboratively. They get to, so to speak, cheat, work together on the test. The reason this is valuable for us as a sort of minimal psychometric experiment is that by having the individual measurement and having these items pulled from the same pool of items, we have this kind of we're able to form this sort of counterfactual argument, which is how well each of these students would have done individually on the collaborative test if they had been working alone. And we can actually make that probabilistic statement on each individual item, like what is the probability they would have gotten this right by themselves. And then we see what happens when they work together. So we can get a direct effect size measurement of their collaboration. And we can also look at sort of more complicated statistical models. And I'll throw up some of those equations just momentarily, but it's not really the focus of this talk. And the way we are going to do the experiment is to repurpose some publicly released NAEP math items that are sort of grade 12 for national assessment of math. They don't really go beyond base algebra and geometry, and then collect pilot data from Amazon Mechanical Turk. And I mentioned some of my NYU and ETS collaborators at the bottom of the slide. So here are some of the design considerations for developing this XBlock. Functionality, as I said, is we just want to be able to have small group chat as opposed to everyone who is online at being in one kind of big IRC type chat room. So that actually also is something that does exist in OpenEdX, but we wanted to be able to have small groups where the instructor could decide how big they are, and they would maybe either be randomly assigned on a kind of first come basis, or predefined if there was, if the instructor knows the class and wants to assign groups every week, or they might be conditionally assigned, which would be, for example, to have a mixture of a more heterogeneous group if you wanted a mixture of male and female students, or high performing and middle performing and low performing students. So there could be other bases for constructing the groups. We wanted you to be able to use this small group chat alongside any OpenEdX media that you would have learning or assessment units. And for me, I wanted it to be part of the same server stack, and people have certainly made the case that that's not necessary. So to some extent, it was for convenience, because if you're not a pro at setting up different servers and having them kind of communicate with each other, it would be nice to have sort of a one package deal. And the other reason is partly this issue of this shared database. So which goes back to the conditional groupings. So if you want to be able to have people be assigned to groups based on their prior performance or some other demographic features, or both, then you need access to that information, and that information resides in the edX app databases. So if you're sort of sitting in the same place and have access to those databases, then that's fine. But if your chat server is running remotely, then you would need to have a way of sending that information back and forth, and you'd need to know in advance what information you want to send back and forth. So that was another argument for having it all part of the same stack. And then the last functionality consideration, which was important to me, is that if people lost their connection because of a bad connection and came back, they wouldn't lose their group membership. Then there were some look and feel considerations, which may seem more or less important to you depending on your emphasis on aesthetic experiences, but I wanted it to be as seamless as possible with the edX look and feel. That turned out to be a challenge, in part because edX makes very greedy use of window space with assessment items. So if they start to get long, there's a lot of scrolling, and if the originally the chat unit in some of the screenshots that I'll show actually was just kind of part of that vertical array of units on the edX screen, and it would kind of disappear off the screen. So then we kind of moved it to be a floating window. And another look and feel consideration, which anyone who's tried to use OpenEdX to do things that weren't sort of part of the original design may have noticed. It's hard to get edX not to mark things as correct or incorrect, unless it's a survey, in which case there is no correct, and that's okay. But if there are answers that are correct, edX will tell you that, with the red X or the green check mark. And we didn't want that for a couple of reasons, which will become maybe more obvious. But so we had to do some gymnastics to avoid that. You can ask me about that later. Now, for sort of the last sort of set of design considerations, I wanted to speak to the difference between designing for assessment versus designing for learning. So one thing is that assessment, you could think of it as, at least oftentimes, takes place kind of after learning opportunities have already happened. And you want to see if people are now kind of doing what you've trained them or sort of given them guidance to learn how to do. So for an assessment task to have kind of meaningful variance in the quality of responses, you need to allow them to be suboptimal. So scaffolding and scripting, which is good in the beginning, isn't necessarily desirable, because you want to see if the subjects, the students, the examinees are doing this on their own. That doesn't mean you couldn't have feedback, but that is sort of a guiding principle behind the work that I'll show. And again, our first interest here is in the outcomes of collaborating together on solving these math problems, not on the process by which they do that. And that is sort of distinguishes, again, this work from sort of a lot of other work. It's not that we're not interested in the process. We're very much interested in the process, but demonstrating that there is an outcome that is not a trivial outcome was sort of a necessary condition before we would kind of then peel the box open and try to understand the process by which those outcomes occur. So you could sort of say, if you put people together in a group and the group does exactly as well as you expected it to, then there's no reason to probe it further. And then the last consideration is that I'm going to sort of show things that look like I'm making judgments about people's collaboration. And if you're thinking that you would need to pair people up with multiple partners if you were going to make any kind of generalizable statement about their collaboration, then I totally agree with you. Ultimately, you would want repeated measures of these kinds of outcomes if you were trying to actually say something about who's a good collaborator. Okay, so this is like a really brief thing. It's probably obvious to everybody who's online, but if you're not sort of very proficient in the edX technology stack, you know, the way this whole thing came together, it's just built on OpenEdX. The XBlock is this kind of Python wrapper for adding functionality of a certain item type or a certain feature that you can have in OpenEdX. And then there's this chat application, which is a really basic kind of Ajax-y PHP thing. You don't need OpenEdX to use this thing, but you do need the kind of basic LAMP stack. So if you are setting up OpenEdX, and all of the installation instructions for using this are on the GitHub repository, and I hope they're usable. I've had a couple of people use them successfully. Then you might need to add some things that don't come with by default with the Cypress installation of OpenEdX. Okay, so this is what it looks like if you're an author and you've installed it. When you go to create content in OpenEdX, you create a unit, and when you select a unit, you get this opportunity to add a component like a problem or discussion. That's an asynchronous thing, or just a block of HTML or a video. And if you've enabled the CPSX as an advanced unit, then you get that advanced button, which otherwise doesn't appear if you don't have any advanced units activated. And then once you've chosen it, you may have more than just this here, but if you have the CPSX, you'll have this collaborative problem-solving unit, and so you select that for your unit. And this is the only configuration that you do. You give it a name, and the purpose of that name is that in OpenEdX, the student may navigate from different screens to do a sequence of assessment items or learning progression of learning content. And if you use this name everywhere you put this unit, then that conversation will follow them around. If you use a different name, then theoretically a student can be in two different rooms at the same time, though that's probably not advisable. And then the group size, which is pretty self-explanatory, how many students you want to work together. This is a minimum and a maximum. So what happens is it just waits until there's this many people, and then it launches that group. And that's a potential improvement that I'll talk about later. You may want 3, but you're willing to stop and launch 2 if enough time has passed and a third person isn't there. And then the wait time is this just queuing problem, which you have inevitably if you need synchronous chat, is that someone may come and say, I'm ready, and no one else is there. So it will set a little countdown timer for a certain period of time, and then it'll say, hey, the timer expired. Do you want to reset the timer? So they're not just then expected to wait indefinitely. So that's a queuing problem. So this is what it looks like. Actually, it looks a little bit different now. I'll show this when I just sort of go to an example. But there would be a button. Usually you would want to do that before you start to see the assessment items, but here it is just underneath the item. When they click that button, that queuing will initiate, and it's just sort of under a standard kind of numerical response item. So they'll see that countdown clock, and then someone else is available, and it'll say, hey, you're ready, we'll begin. And then that's a sort of typical looking chat window. Actually, we've made it look a little bit better now. And this explicit logout button exists to deal with that loss of connection issue that I mentioned. So they'll still be in this room forever until they log out. That way, even if they, turn their computer off or go log in from another computer, they'll still be in it. You could do a garbage cleaning process if you want to make sure that students who haven't done anything in a room for a long time close that room. But that's that. Okay, so here's the result of some work, some real early pilot work, and I'm going to introduce the data before having introduced the models or anything. Just if you look at this picture, what you're looking on the horizontal axis is a theta, which is a kind of the psychometrician's way of talking about ability measurement. So it's a kind of ability score on math, and it's unit normalized, so 0 is a mean ability. And on the horizontal axis is the theta computed for the pair working together. So each of these points represents the person who took that individual test and then was paired up with a partner and did another test. And because the partners give the same answers, theoretically they should give the same answers, although they're not forced to give the same answers. After discussing it, then they're going to earn the same score together, but the individual test, they may have started from a very different place. The way that ability is computed is not a simple sum score of the ones they get correct. It uses item response theory model. So one of the things you can observe in this picture of pilot data from our friends is that they tend to be pretty good at math, in that they're at the higher end of the spectrum of ability from mean and up. They're above average. They collaborated effectively in the sense that they give the same answers after discussing, and that in many cases, that collaborative ability, the ability they display on working together, is very consistent with the ability of the better partner to begin with. That would be sort of like, if you know a lot of more math than I do and we work together, then we're just going to basically be as good together as you are alone. But in at least one case, this kind of orangey red set of points, there were two subjects who, were at like 0.7 standard deviations above average, and they both performed quite similarly on the individual portion. But then they're like a 1.4 standard deviations above average when they work together. So there's something kind of like really effective collaboration happening in that one pair out of these 8 pairs. Now, this is what happened when we did our first data collection with a crowd work population via Mechanical Turk. There's pretty good evidence that they didn't collaborate at all, because that horizontal tendency of giving the same answers and thus getting the same scores isn't there. They were given the same affordance, which is this chat window, and they were told to work with their partner, but they kind of just didn't. And the fact that the points are distributed fairly noisily, but distributed around that 1-to-1 line, means that these tests, were just 2 different tests of the same thing. They're sort of test-retest on math ability, and that's all you're getting. So this was clearly not going to be usable data for us, and we told the Turkers in the next data collection that we wouldn't pay them if they didn't give the same answers as their partner, and then that happened. So that was good. That money is the motivator to get them to at least kind of follow the instructions, which is talk to your partner and discuss the problem before answering it. And there's still a sort of question of how much of this is really successful collaboration. And so one way you could kind of do this is in a heuristic way, is you could do this filter. And the filter says that you have an estimate of how much noise or measurement error you have. And so what you're looking at is cases in which both partners' proficiencies improved by more than the measurement error. In this case, that threshold may be a little bit generous. There are some points that are kind of close to the line. But again, they're actually at least 0.35 standard deviations away. So these could be examples. In that data collection. There were about 48 pairs, and so there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-ish. About 10 left who looked pretty decent. And just because you have to do some really hokey analysis, it's not the number of chats, it's not the length of the discussion. In this case, this is sort of the distribution in the number of lines of chat for all of the pairs that we collected, and then in green is sort of the subset of the ones that had this performance improvement. And you can see that there's no real compelling reason to believe that those distributions are different. So that's all I'm really going to say about that, but I will show a sample chat log because I know there are people potentially listening who are interested in actually doing kind of a discourse analysis. Some of this is good, which is, like trying to figure out what the question is asking, and also sort of like positive affect in the line, me either, lol, smiley face, sort of like supporting each other's confusion about the problem. So that's good. Other times you also see evidence of kind of low conscientiousness, like they look at the next problem beginning in this line like 5259. Doesn't seem like it has the info. Yeah, if I had to guess 15, okay, like we're done. So I mean, this is a case where there's maybe a difficult problem and the crowd workers are not really that intent on struggling with it for very long. If they don't immediately know the answer, they just agree to guess. And then at the end, they say, get that money. So that sort of does indicate that that's really what's sort of fueling their motivation in this particular kind of population. So I said that I would show a little bit about this. We have sort of more technical documents about the psychometrics, but here's what I mean about the kind of work that we're doing on the psychometric side, which is sort of trying to distinguish a model for how the performance of two people depends on their counterfactual performance individually. So the first model is deliberately kind of a straw man. It is a model that communicates something like the probability of you and I both getting an answer correct is just the probability of me getting it correct times the probability of you getting it correct. The only sort of realistic scenario that would create data that looked like that would be if we were in separate cells and we weren't actually even allowed to talk to each other, and we both took the test, but the prison guard scored us as correct if we were both right and otherwise not. And so then the independence model would be observed. But at least we can confirm that that's not happening when people are collaborating. The more likely models are these sort of models that, for example, the third one in the middle, which is that sort of maximum performance, which I said and indicated just from looking at those plots, two people are likely to get it right insofar as the higher ability person is likely to get it right. So that could be a sort of freeloader effect. And then the last two models, which are sort of get more complicated, are the ones in which we are both contributing and to some extent complementing each other's knowledge. So that may not be, the first one may not be so profound as a model of collaboration, but it is true collaboration if you put two people together and some of them know how to do some things and other ones know how to do complementary things, and therefore together they can do more things. That is, it's not like a profound synergy, but it is collaboration. And then in the sort of last model, we don't necessarily both bring it all, one of us might bring more to the contribution than the other one, and we're still working out under what conditions that last model is identifiable. So that's sort of a mathematical problem for us that we're working on. All right, so some early lessons from the pilot work. As I said, the crowd workers are not necessarily conscientious, and one of the things that we were thinking about is if we want to continue to collect data that way, maybe re-incentivize them or gamify it by rewarding correctness on individual items. So that could be seen as an extrinsic motivator. There were some pairs that did do well, but so that was a good proof of concept. We're not saying that that would enable us to give a profile of somebody as a collaborator. And again, Mechanical Turk is not an environment where we're likely to be able to get the same person paired with lots of different people. It may be, but I'm not optimistic about it. Anyway, we want to be able to do this with high school or undergraduate population. So we are planning a small study with NYU undergrads. But the main takeaway was that this worked in principle, and it could get way more interesting if the items got more interesting. So that's what I want to talk about for sort of the last 10 minutes is in the first study, there wasn't a difference between the kind of math questions that were asked in the individual and collaborative conditions. They're just drawn from the same pool of math items, which were originally multiple choice items that we converted into free numerical response items by just removing the multiple choices. But those items were designed for testing individuals, not for collaboration. We still wanted to see what would happen if you allowed two people to take that test together. On the other hand, if there is a sort of interdependence, a positive interdependence between the two partners, it's extrinsic if present at all, not intrinsic to the task. So they may want to do a good job, and so they'll try to work together. So that's intrinsic to the person, but they will want to do a good job in the case of Mechanical Turk because they think their payment might depend on it. Not because the task, however, doesn't force them in any way to work together. So this led us to where, what our extension now, which is a set of new math items that have intrinsic interdependence. And I'm really excited about this work, so hopefully we'll be able to communicate some of that excitement to you. There are a few varieties, and I'll kind of talk about the first two on this list. The first one I called jigsaw problems, but I wrote kind of Pache Elliott Aronson because we've really stripped the idea of the jigsaw down to like the barest bones, which is just that you divide information between the students or the examinees. This isn't jigsaw in the sense of like, you went and researched like the economic impacts of this decision, and I went and researched the social impacts of this decision, and then we had this ill-posed problem that we had to come about with different expertise, which is sort of the real classroom use of jigsaw pedagogy. But we're just dividing information in such a way that you can't solve this problem without at least communicating that information to each other at minimum. And so we use the cohort content features of OpenEdX to do that. And I'll give some examples of how that can become progressively more interesting than the trivial example I start with. And then the other problems, which we don't have a finalized name for, in preparing the slide, I thought of calling them request information problems because that's funny. But in this type of problem, you withhold information that is necessary to solve the problem from both examinees, and then you give them a chance to get some of that information by kind of like spending a hint or a token to get it. And then you can give this problem to an individual by giving them 2 tokens, or you can give it to 2 people by giving them 1 each. And I'll show you in an example of how they will need to negotiate in order to do that effectively. And so this approach is partly inspired by Kathy Harper's work in the physics education research community. Okay, so let me start with a jigsaw. Here's a really simple jigsaw really, really basic. It's called a level 1, if there is even a point to it in the ladder of jigsaw problems. You ask, what's the average of your number and your partner's number? And then you and your partner see different numbers, and you know that, so you have a chat window. So you just have to communicate. My number's 4. And now, basically, once that communication is done, we should both be able to do this problem. But if only one of us can answer the question, we can just communicate the answer back to the other one. So that's kind of like the simplest example. It gets a little bit trickier, I think. I mean, this is a sort of question for an empirical question with some cognitive theory behind it, that as the representation gets abstract, it gets more complicated. So this is the same question, of course, what's the average? But it's expressed in these kinds of algebraic formalism, and so that raises the representational complexity. And another version of this is a graphical representation. So I'm putting these on the same level. Here, the stem is, you're shown some chips and your partner is shown some chips, and they're both placed in a sack and mixed up. And then Mary draws a chip from the sack. What's the probability that she draws a chip with an even number? So in this case, this is actually a problem where clearly the chips were just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in the individual condition, but in the other condition, and in the pair condition, you get different representations, graphical. This is a level up, which is a word problem representation of a math exercise, but the information is sort of implicitly missing. So actually, if you were paying attention to the screenshot before, the item on the page was this item in where all of the information is given. In other words, the size of the shipment of batteries, the size of the sample, and the number of batteries in that sample found to be dead. But instead, in this version, the two students see a kind of incomplete information. But they're not told that they have incomplete information. So that's why I say this is implicitly missing information. And then here's, I think, a level 4 example that we have developed, which is different graphical representations. So this is a question in which they're going to be ultimately asked to find an average pulse rate in a sample. They're both given representations of data where some of it has been censored, or hidden, but it's different portions. So in this case, it's the same data represented on the left and the right-hand side, but each of them will get one of these representations. And so to communicate that, they really need to understand that they're looking at different representations. Okay, so there was a little bit in some of those jigsaw examples that I gave about this kind of motivation for the next set of the RIP, the request information problems, but more of it's coming up. So I'll sort of present this. This looks really complicated, but basically, Kathy Harper and collaborators were thinking about problem-solving skills in kind of physics and engineering education, and the fact that textbook problems tend to give students exactly the information that they need to answer the problem, and there's exactly one answer to the problem. And so they do this thing where they like fish around for the right equation that connects all of the givens and the unknown, and then solve it. I mean, that kind of like hunt and peck sort of strategy for problem solving is well known to physics education researchers. And on the left side, this figure taken from their 2006 conference paper, they're showing the sort of processes that are involved if the provided information is either exactly sufficient, insufficient, or excessive, like extra information and extraneous information is given, and if the answer itself has no answer, one answer, or more than one answer. And they're trying to communicate in that left side figure that there's a richer scenario if insufficient information or excessive information is given, if there's more answers. But on the right-hand side, they show that they surveyed traditional STEM textbooks. They also did this with reform textbooks, and the answers, the values are basically the same. That almost all of the problems, by far the lion's share, are in that kind of exact information is given and there's one answer. All right, so hopefully that's kind of clear enough to motivate this type of thing. So this is a question with a right triangle, and normally in this kind of thing in a math problem, you're given exactly the amount of information you need, and there's sort of one way to solve the problem. Maybe you're given two sides, and you would use the Pythagorean theorem, or you're given an angle and a side, and you would use some trigonometric identity to find it. What we've done instead is give no information, just label the triangle, and then ask the student, what information do you want in order to solve for H? And in this example, which is the one that's in the collaborative condition, you only get one hint request, and your partner gets one hint request. And you need to negotiate this with each other, because if you both ask for the same thing, or even if you both ask for angles, you won't be able to solve it. And you need to know how you're going to solve it too, because if you want to solve it using the Pythagorean theorem, you need the two sides, right? And if you want to use a trigonometric identity with an angle, that's probably not the one that most students are going to choose. But it presents them a different way of doing this problem. So this is ongoing work that I wanted to show and get some sort of feedback from all of you about. We're working on these models, we're working on these new items, and maybe thinking about ultimately a kind of suite of math items that have this collaborative nature that can be used instructionally. We're trying to do the study with undergrads, and we do have an interest, though we don't really have the staff for parsing the chats themselves to characterize the collaboration processes. And then we're constantly trying to improve the XBlock. So on sort of my final kind of end thank you slide, I show what are some of the things that we would like to make more part of this tool. So one is that the criteria for pairing by default is just random. You can make non-random pairing if you modify the code yourself, because you can condition on anything in the database, but this isn't like a user configurable thing in the tool as written. It's not easy to use. There's no synchronization control in working through a sequence of edX items typically. Like every student can kind of move at their own pace. So that's something that we're thinking about, whether they, we should make it so that the one student can't move ahead of the other one if they're supposed to be working together. And it would hugely change what we could do if they actually had a shared manipulable or a shared whiteboard, something that they could both manipulate, and it would affect what the other person sees. Auto-completion is kind of like a small scale improvement. There's this sort of question in my mind, which is that I have no idea what would happen to this tool if 10,000 students were using it at the same time, because that's really beyond my expertise in kind of hacking together something like this. So those are sort of topics on the wish list for people who want to participate in the development of that tool. And that's what I wanted to talk about. So I guess I will hand the microphone back over to Carolyn.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting. And I have a list of questions here for you. So where to start? So one thing is that it seems like there are so many different things going on here. One is, are you assessing whether the collaboration made the students better problem solvers, or are you assessing their ability to collaborate? Because in some sense, in the beginning, it almost sounded like it was that you were trying to determine whether students benefited from working together or not. But then it seemed like it evolved over time. So would you say that your focus on that front has sort of shifted over time, or am I misunderstanding?
No, I think you are understanding correctly. There is a shift. The first question was, working in the context of something very sort of mathematically ironclad, factual, like, you know, do they do better on a math test when they work together, and do they do better than the better one would have done by themselves? And that differs from this elicitation, the sort of more kind of psychologically interesting domain we're moving in now, of eliciting kind of negotiation and other strategies. But it's not disconnected in the sense that we just think we started with a really low level affordance, like this sort of task just didn't have much collaboration potential in it. And we were kind of like, but if we see a collaboration effect even there, then that's really good. And if we don't, we won't stop. But we did see that some students are able to do more together than either of them would have been expected to do by themselves. So that was kind of like a real encouragement to continue. But I think we always knew that we were interested in this second stage because it's the one that's kind of more authentic, more rich, but still has it's that these aren't ill-defined questions, right? They're totally clear, like correct answers. And there is a version of these that can be done by an individual if you give them the 2 tokens, or if you give them all of the information, even if you give them 2 different graphical representations with the inked out parts. So you can kind of see how difficult this is for individuals. You can see how difficult this is for pairs, and then so you have to have new statistical models, but it still gives us an opportunity to work in this kind of psychometric space that's clean. Instead of this one where it's sort of like, well, we'll give them these tasks that are cognitively rich and understood to be ill-defined and therefore elicit a broad range of group dynamics, right? Like dominance behaviors and turn-taking and leadership and negotiation. But then we don't really know, we end up falling back on some sort of expert on groups who looks at that and says, that was a good group, you know, and that's it. Like, yeah.
So, there's also, so I guess I have 2 questions that are coming in my brain at the same time here, because it started with, you know, well, why are you doing these math problems anyway if what you want to do is assess collaboration? Because it seems like what you're coming up against is the challenge of trying to take these problems from these math books and turn them into something that creates an opportunity for collaboration when they actually weren't designed as collaborative problems. And you could have picked problems that are, you know, more obvious collaboration problems. But on the other side, it also occurs to me that it sounds like your focus is purely on success means that the problem that they're working on now, they can do better at producing a solution. Whereas actually in most of the collaborative learning work that I've done, it's been a very different focus. It's in working together on these problems, do they come out with more of an ability to solve problems in the future, like on the post-test? And I don't recall if you mentioned a post-test. So I guess it leads me to wonder, again, in your mind, where this work is actually fitting in someplace. You know, what are you kind of going for? Because if it's collaboration in order to support learning, you might go in one direction and stick with the math problems in the book. But if it's about, I want to assess the ability of someone to collaborate, then maybe using problems that give more opportunity, you know, why would you stick with these math textbook problems?
Oh, well, okay. I definitely don't feel like I want to stick with the math textbook problems. Let me answer the question about sort of how does this fit into other stuff? Like, what is this useful for? So there's a couple of answers to that. One is that testing right now, like when done sort of individually, is this kind of high anxiety provoking experience for kids in school, where it's like, now I'm being given this, you know, math test and I have to answer. And, you know, I'm certainly a believer that you need to, every once in a while, sort of measure the learning that's happening in order to make sure it's happening and support what needs to be supported. But if there are ways to do that that are both more authentic to the kinds of behaviors we want these kids to participate in later in life, which is, find how to work together with other people to solve problems, not always solve them by themselves, and also reduce the stress of that examination. And so if some of the kind of testing that happens about math ability can happen with peers, I think that provides sort of both less stressful and more authentic contextual measurement of math ability, like measurement of math ability. And that contextual thing sort of touches a little bit on the kind of Vygotskian sort of what you're able to do with guidance. So, which differs from what you're able to do on your own. And so it probes this kind of larger, fuzzier sphere around what the individual measurement can do. So that's sort of how the measurement piece fits. And the reason we just didn't want to muddy the waters, so to speak. And this is, again, like coming from a measurement perspective, it's all about sort of like, clean, precise measurements. And we know that these are, we believe these are valid math questions because they've been sort of validated and tested a lot. So now we can introduce the first wrinkle, which is having two people work together and keep it very, very clean. And then the next thing we can do is now start to relax the items to be more interesting and more evocative of collaboration behaviors. And by mixing those together with the traditional ones in a measurement, we can sort of adiabatically move our measurement ability in the direction of that more interesting instrument.
That's great. Let's see here. Another question I have is, I just didn't see this in your slide. So I see a very careful moving towards being able to deconstruct kinds of problems and thinking about the association between those kinds of problems and the opportunities. But what I am wondering is whether you have also kind of deconstructed collaboration into component skills, or if you see it as being more of a sort of gestalt skill. You're good at collaboration or you're not, and so I think it's not clear.
I would say that, yeah, we are sort of, and I'm not endorsing, but we are kind of in this line of work taking that kind of gestalt position, that the proof is in the pudding, right? That we're not going to kind of make expectations about what are the dimensions of collaboration and a profile that, you're good at turn taking, but you're not good at negotiating, or we're going to just try to create multiple affordances for you to be successful at it or not successful at it. And to some extent, that success can be visible to the learner. In this exam, it isn't, because we don't tell them whether their answer was right. And we don't tell them because we don't want them to become demoralized if they're getting a lot of problems wrong. But if the same thing were used in a learning environment where it would be totally cool to be like, actually, that's not the right answer. Do you want to try again? They would see that, and they might then see in the kind of dashboard sense that they have been able to do stuff when they work with others that they couldn't do by themselves.
So here's another question for you. So it sounds like this proof is in the pudding idea might be construed as assuming that if a student fails to demonstrate a collaborative skill, it means that they don't have that skill. But what about that they don't feel comfortable in this setting demonstrating it? So maybe they have the ability to articulate their reasoning, but they're afraid that the other person is going to think that they're stupid, and so then they don't say something. Is it reasonable, given the proof is in the pudding approach, to say, well, it doesn't matter if they could do it if they refuse, we're going to say we're assessing whether they demonstrated their collaborative skill? Or do you see that as an issue, something to tease apart going forward, that you want to separate out what are they able to do from what maybe they just chose not to do for some social or motivational reason?
It's a real issue. It's the same issue that you have in any measurement, even in just an individual test, right? So if you want your instrument to measure math ability, and a student has severe test anxiety whenever they sit down to write a test, you're going to have this construct irrelevant effect that is preventing them from demonstrating their ability. And so I think that's like a real source of validity, problems that you need to be aware of and keep in mind from how do you interpret those results. Like, that's the validity problem, is once you see this kind of collaboration effect, how do you interpret it? Do you use it as a kind of consequential judgment on this person and say, well, we're never going to put you in a group ever again because you're hopeless? No, that would be a bad outcome. So you would definitely want to be attuned to the possibility that there are alternative explanations for what's happening.
Okay. One other question on this front. Oh, shoot. It's slipping my mind. Oh, the jigsaw part of it. Yeah. So you were talking about different kinds of jigsaw problems, and it sounded like you thought manipulating the jigsaw was somehow not a good way of doing the assessment, but it seemed to me that it might make it easier for you to determine whether you're able with your models to distinguish between different kinds of situations. You had that list of different models. If you actually manipulated for this same pair of students the properties of the problems, where manipulating the nature of the jigsaw is one way of saying, how does this person respond to different kinds of opportunities? Have you thought about that kind of experimental design for doing your assessment and also being able to approach these questions about what can we actually distinguish between with our models?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, and it sounds really interesting, so I'm going to ask for clarification on the manipulating the jigsaw. What did you mean, and what did you think I didn't want to do?
Okay, so when you were discussing the different natured problems, and you brought in this jigsaw idea, you were also explaining what's different about the way you used a jigsaw and how it's been used in previous research. For example, having students specialize in different areas so that you know that when you come in, you're the specialist in this area, right. There are other specialists in other areas, and it creates a certain kind of expectation for interdependence, and also well, in some ways making it artificially obvious how to do it, but in other ways then being able to isolate under conditions of obviousness, will you do it, versus did you recognize that somebody had that expertise, for example. So you had a set of different models, and I think this came up later in your talk, different mathematical formulations that should fit under different situations depending upon how the students are collaborating or what the collaborative need is maybe, or how they're the structure of the collaboration as they recognize it. And you had raised the question, will we be able to determine that in this particular situation that the model that's intended to fit that situation is actually the best fitting model? And then it seemed to me that in a way, the process as I hear it when you're talking about it sounds like you're designing kinds of problems, then you're waiting to see what the nature of the collaboration is, and then you're looking to see which of these models fit. But another more top-down way of doing it would be to intentionally manipulate the setting or the structure of the problems or how you're preparing people for it in order to systematically change what you think should be the best fitting model, and then you can check to see if in fact the model that you expected, whether it changed, the model fit, does it systematically change over these different conditions of problems? Because then you would have data sets where it was more balanced and you knew what to expect and what should be happening. It might be more obvious then which things might slip past a model. So maybe so one thing we've seen, for example, in cases where we've had a series of models, kind of like your series of models where we've said, under different circumstances, these different models should fit. But what we found sometimes is that sometimes a drastically similar model, a simpler model, will fit just as well in the series because there's sort of a shortcut way that it can catch up on a missed state that we might not have anticipated when we design that series of models. And so you might not actually discover this problem with the, use model fit as a way of telling which of these situations we're in, unless you kind of had systematically manipulated the data so you could have seen, oh, it doesn't actually progress the way I expected it to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's definitely an important consideration in the kinds of models that would be applied in the new Jigsaw-y items. So I agree with you. One thing that I think I probably failed to clarify is the models that I showed aren't really applicable yet there in that domain at all, because they're all built on this kind of counterfactual that we know how you would have done on this problem on your own. And so they only really work in the domain of pulling items from the same pool of ones that are just sort of written for individuals. And there, what we were trying to do is kind of make an argument that would appeal to a statistician, not a kind of predictive model, but a model that says what these two people did together is not consistent with just the better one doing all the work. It actually is too good, you know, like it's sort of statistically improbable that they didn't both contribute in that kind of way. So it was, yeah, but in order to be able to make those dry but sort of decisive claims, we were working with those repeated items just being sort of standard items. As soon as the item changes from what the individual has to do to what they would do if they were working with somebody else, because they don't have the information. So it's like, I can't solve this problem by myself. It's impossible, you know, without you. And if you are a foil deliberately for whatever reason, like you're a malevolent player, then I can't do it. So clearly the model has to change.
Well, this has been fascinating. And actually, I have more questions, but we're at the end of our time, so I may just email those to you. But thank you so much for spending this time. And we're really excited about the work that ETS is doing on assessment of collaboration. I think it's a wide open, very complex, very interesting space. And we'll be on the lookout for more of your papers going forward.
Thanks for having me.